Jasmine Crockett collapses. After John Kennedy exposes secret affairs on live TV, the Dallas studio buzzed with a tension that seemed to seep into every corner, from the polished floors to the sleek curved table at the heart of the Stateline Live set. It wasn't the usual pre-show nerves that had the crew moving with clipped precision, checking headsets, adjusting lights, and triple-testing microphones. This was something heavier, a gut-level anticipation that made interns freeze mid-step and producers exchange hushed glances. By 7:40 p.m., every seat in the audience was claimed, filled with a mix of political diehards, local reporters, and influencers clutching phones like lifelines. The air felt charged, as if the room itself knew something was about to break. At the center of the set, under glaring studio lights, sat Senator John Kennedy, his navy suit crisp, his red tie a bold slash against his white shirt. His hands rested on a thin folder, his fingers occasionally brushing its edge, a gesture that seemed casual but carried the weight of intent. His eyes, sharp behind a practiced smile, scanned the room with the confidence of a man who'd played this game before. Opposite him was Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett, her black blazer tailored to a fault, her white blouse softened by a single silver necklace that glinted when she shifted. Her hands were folded, her posture steady, but her gaze held a fire that suggested she was ready for whatever was coming. Between them sat Terrence Vann, a broadcaster, with 30 years of wrangling live TV chaos, his salt and pepper hair and easy charm usually enough to keep things smooth. Tonight, though, his jaw was tight, his note cards gripped a little too firmly. He glanced at the producer's booth, then the clock. 20 seconds, a voice crackled through the headset. The audience phones, already glowing, sat in near silence, their anticipation a living thing. The rumors had been simmering for days. Vague whispers on social media, a leaked email here, a cryptic post there. Nobody had hard details, but the buzz was unmistakable. Something big was brewing. Kennedy hadn't hinted at his plans, not in interviews or his usual folksy quips, but his presence tonight felt deliberate, like a chess player who'd already seen the board's endgame. Crockett, too, carried an air of readiness, her silence in the lead-up a signal she was braced for a fight. 10 seconds, the producer called. The lights flared, washing the set in a stark glow. Terrence cleared his throat, smoothed his tie, and gave a nod to the camera. The red light blinked on. "Good evening, and welcome to Stateline Live." He began, his voice polished, but tinged with caution. "Tonight, we're joined by two remarkable voices to discuss trust, accountability, and the state of public service. Senator John Kennedy, thank you for being here." Kennedy leaned forward, his drawl warm, disarming. "Happy to be here, Terrence. Always good to talk about what folks care about." Terrence turned to Crockett. "And Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett, thank you for joining us." She didn't smile, her eyes locking onto the camera. "It's where I need to be," she said, her tone clipped, purposeful. Terrence chuckled, a reflex to buy time, and dove into the first question. "Let's start with trust. What builds it in our leaders, and what tears it down?" Crockett answered first, her words deliberate, each one landing like a stone. "Trust is earned when you show up, do the work, and tell the truth, even when it's hard. It's lost when people hide behind titles, thinking they're above answering for their choices." Her gaze flicked to Kennedy, brief but pointed, and the audience stirred, sensing the undercurrent. Kennedy nodded, his smile unwavering, but his eyes narrowed slightly. "Trust goes both ways," he said, his voice slow, almost conversational. "People want leaders who shoot straight, but they don't need every detail of their lives dragged out for show. Sometimes what folks call transparency is just a fancy way of making noise." A few in the audience murmured, some nodding, others frowning. Terrence seized the moment, leaning in. "Senator, are you saying some truths are better kept private?" Kennedy's smile sharpened his gaze, sliding to Crockett. "I'm saying there's a line between what's public business and what's just a spectacle. I reckon the Congresswoman knows that line pretty well." The room seemed to hold its breath, the silence so thick it was almost audible. Crockett's jaw tightened, but her voice stayed even. "If the senator's got something to say, I'd rather he say it plain than hide behind riddles." Terrence, sensing the shift, tried to steer back. "Let's keep this broad public accountability. Congresswoman, should leaders disclose everything to maintain trust?" Crockett's eyes stayed on Kennedy. "Not everything. But when your actions raise questions about who you're serving, you don't get to duck those questions. You owe the truth." Kennedy leaned back, his fingers tapping the folder once, twice. "That's a fine standard, Jasmine. But it only works if you're living up to it yourself." The audience gasped, a sharp, collective sound that rippled through the studio. Terrence's note cards slipped in his hand. "Senator, that's a strong statement. Can you clarify?" Kennedy opened the folder, revealing a stack of papers, some with highlighted lines. "I'm not here to sling mud, Terrence. I'm here to ask why the Congresswoman took an unlisted trip to Lisbon last year, paid for by a company that's hard to track down." Crockett's hands clenched, her knuckles paling. "If you're making accusations, Senator, you'd better have proof." Kennedy's voice stayed calm, but his words cut deep. "I've got proof, Congresswoman. Flight logs, hotel records, and someone who says you weren't traveling alone." The studio was a vacuum. No coughs, no whispers, just the hum of cameras. Crockett leaned forward, her voice low, fierce. "You're treading on thin ice, John. If you're wrong, you'll regret it. If you're right, you'd better be ready for what follows." Terrence tried to intervene, his voice strained. "Let's stay constructive," but Kennedy pressed on, pulling out a single sheet. "This is a customs log from Lisbon, private jet, tail number N327KL. Your initials on the manifest, Congresswoman. Why wasn't that trip disclosed?" Crockett's eyes flicked to the paper, then back to Kennedy, a flash of uncertainty crossing her face, gone in an instant. "Initials aren't evidence, and you know it." Kennedy's tone didn't waver. "Then let's try the hotel. Grand Lisboa, same night, booked under a pseudonym, paid in cash. Ring any bells?" The silence was deafening, the audience frozen, phones still recording. Terrence, now visibly rattled, tried again. "Senator, these are serious claims. Are you prepared to back them up?" Kennedy kept his eyes on Crockett. "I wouldn't say it if I couldn't." "The question is, Congresswoman, are you prepared to answer?" Crockett's hand gripped the table, her other reaching for her water glass, but it shook the clink loud in the microphones. She set it down, her fingers brushing her forehead, a fleeting gesture of strain. Congresswoman, Terrence asked, his voice tight. She opened her mouth, but no words came. Her shoulders slumped, her head tilted, and then, in a heartbeat, she slid sideways. Her hand missed the table, her body folding like a broken reed. The microphone on her blazer popped, a sharp crack that jolted the room. "Cut the feed," a producer yelled, but the cameras kept rolling, streaming to millions. A stagehand dove forward, catching her arm just shy of the floor. Gasps erupted, followed by panicked murmurs. Terrence stood, his cards scattering. Medical now, Kennedy sat still, his folder closed, his face unreadable. Paramedics rushed in, their presence a grim nod to the producer's foresight, though they'd expected verbal fireworks, not this. Crockett was breathing, her eyes fluttering, but her face was ashen. Fainted, a paramedic said, loud enough for the mics. "Stress, maybe. We'll take her in." The audience was chaos, whispers. Tears, phones still filming. Terrence faced the camera, voice shaking, We're taking a break. We'll be back." The screen went dark, but the moment was already immortal, racing across the internet, a spark that would ignite everything to come. The blackout on the State Line Live broadcast lasted only 6 minutes, but it was enough to set the world on fire. By the time the screen flickered back to a generic network logo, the internet had already dissected every frame of Jasmine Crockett's collapse. Clips of her trembling hand, her faltering words, and the moment her body crumpled were looping across social media, each one captioned with speculation, outrage, or sympathy. On Twitter, #CrockettCollapse hit #1 in the US within 10 minutes with a grainy phone video from the audience shot from the third row, racking up 1.8 million views before the hour was out. TikTok exploded with slowed-down edits, some overlaying dramatic music, others zooming in on John Kennedy's unyielding stare as Crockett fell. A single tweet. She didn't just collapse, she was pushed, went viral, shared 200,000 times. The studio, meanwhile, was chaos. Crew members scrambled to clear the set, paramedics wheeled Crockett out through a side exit, and Terrence Vann stood off camera wiping sweat from his brow, muttering to a producer about how he'd never seen anything like it. John Kennedy hadn't moved from his seat, his folder still closed, his face a mask of calm that only deepened the frenzy. Audience members, now spilling into the Dallas night, were already uploading their own footage, their voices hushed but urgent, describing the moment the air seemed to vanish from the room. Backstage, a producer hissed into a headset, "We should have cut sooner. This is a PR nightmare." But it was too late. The story wasn't theirs anymore. It belonged to the world. In living rooms across America, people leaned closer to their screens, some horrified, others riveted. News networks scrambled to keep up CNN running a breaking news banner. Congresswoman Crockett collapses during heated live debate. MSNBC brought in a panel of analysts who barely had time to skim the clips before going on air, their voices overlapping as they tried to parse what had happened. Fox News aired a split screen of Crockett's fall and Kennedy's folder with a pundit speculating whatever's in those papers, it was enough to shake her. On YouTube, amateur sleuths were already uploading breakdowns, zooming in on the customs log Kennedy had flashed, debating whether the initials JC were definitive proof. Reddit threads mushroomed one titled, "Is Kennedy a hero or a bully?" gaining 10,000 upvotes in an hour. The public was split. Some saw Kennedy as a truth-teller, exposing a politician's hypocrisy. Others saw him as a ruthless opportunist, ambushing Crockett for clout. A tweet from a Dallas teacher summed up the divide. Kennedy came prepared, but did he have to go that far? Crockett's human, not a punching bag. It was shared 50,000 times with replies ranging from, "She deserved it," to, "This was a setup." Crockett, now in a private room at a nearby hospital, was conscious but shaken. The paramedics had ruled out anything life-threatening, a likely vasovagal response, they said, triggered by stress and dehydration. Her chief of staff, Keon Pard, stood by her bedside, his phone buzzing non-stop with texts from AIDS reporters and even a congressman offering support. "You don't have to say anything yet," Keon told her, his voice low but firm. Crockett, propped up on pillows, her blazer folded neatly on a chair, stared at the ceiling. "He didn't just come for me, Keon," she said, her voice hoarse. "He came for everything I've built." Keon didn't argue. He'd already seen the headlines, the memes, the hashtags. Crockett Caught was trending alongside #Crockett Collapse, and the narrative was slipping out of their control. "We'll get ahead of this," he said, but even he wasn't sure how. Outside reporters camped near the hospital entrance, their cameras trained on the glass doors, hoping for a glimpse of Crockett or her team. A local news van broadcast live, the anchor's voice breathless, Questions are swirling about what Senator Kennedy revealed and what it means for Congresswoman Crockett's future. The storm grew darker when a new voice entered the fray. At 9:17 p.m., a woman named Lena Harris, identifying herself as Crockett's former aide, posted a cryptic thread on Twitter. "I worked for Jasmine Crockett for 2 years," it began. "I know things about that Lisbon trip. It wasn't what people think, but it wasn't nothing either." The thread, vague but suggestive, hinted at unreported meetings and a pattern of secrecy without providing specifics. It spread like wildfire, retweeted 30,000 times in an hour, with users demanding details. "Spill the tea." Lena, one reply, read like 12,000 times. Lena didn't elaborate, but the damage was done. Her words gave Kennedy's accusations a veneer of credibility, even without hard evidence. Crockett's supporters pushed back, flooding social media with defenses. "This is a smear campaign," one Instagram post declared, showing a photo of Crockett at a community event smiling with kids. "She's fought for us. Don't let them tear her down." But the doubters were louder, their voices amplified by the spectacle of the collapse. A conservative blogger posted, "If Crockett's clean, why'd she faint? Guilty conscience." It got 80,000 likes. In the hospital, Keon showed Crockett the Twitter thread on his phone. She read it in silence, her face unreadable. "Lena," she said finally, almost to herself. "She left on bad terms, didn't she?" Keon nodded. "Yeah. Budget disputes, nothing major. But she's got an axe to grind now." Crockett closed her eyes, exhaling slowly. Kennedy didn't just find that folder. He found her. Keon didn't respond, but he knew she was right. The precision of Kennedy's attack, the customs log, the hotel details, now Lena's thread suggested preparation, maybe even coordination. But proving that would take time, and time was a luxury they didn't have. The hospital room felt smaller with every notification on Keon's phone, each one a reminder that the world was watching, judging, dissecting. "What do we do?" Keon asked, his voice quieter than usual. Crockett opened her eyes, her gaze steady, despite the IV in her arm. "We don't hide. That's what they want. We face it." Back at the studio, Kennedy finally left the set, ignoring the reporters shouting questions as he slipped into a black SUV. His silence was strategic, letting the documents and Crockett's collapse speak for him. His team released a brief statement. Senator Kennedy raised legitimate concerns about transparency in public office. He wishes Congresswoman Crockett a swift recovery and looks forward to continued discussion. It was measured polite and infuriatingly vague, designed to keep the focus on Crockett's reaction rather than his evidence. Pundits ate it up, some praising his restraint, others questioning his motives. A CNN analyst noted Kennedy's playing chess, not checkers. He didn't need to say more, her collapse said it all. But not everyone was convinced. A local Dallas radio host, a longtime Crockett supporter, went on air at 10 p.m., his voice crackling with anger. "John Kennedy didn't bring truth tonight. He brought a performance. And we're not going to let him rewrite Jasmine's story." Callers flooded the lines, some echoing his defense, others demanding Crockett explain the Lisbon trip. Crockett's team, meanwhile, was in crisis mode. In a cramped hospital conference room, Keon and 2 aides huddled over laptops, drafting a statement while fielding calls from allies in Congress. "We need to get out in front of this," one aide insisted, typing furiously. "Say it was a medical episode, nothing to do with guilt." Keon shook his head. "That's not enough." People saw her face. They saw Kennedy's folder. "We need to address the trip." The other aide, a young woman named Tara, looked up from her phone. "Lena's talking to a reporter now. Off the record, but it's gonna leak." She's saying there's more to come. Keon cursed under his breath. We need Jasmine's side, and we need it fast. But Crockett, still under observation, wasn't ready to speak. The doctors wanted her to rest, but she was already sitting up, scrolling through her phone, reading the headlines, the tweets, the venom. They're calling me a fraud, she said to Keon, her voice steady but laced with pain. After everything I've done. Keon knelt beside her. They don't know you. But they will. We'll tell your story. Crockett nodded, but her eyes were distant, calculating. She wasn't just thinking about the trip or Lena or Kennedy. She was thinking about the people watching, the ones who'd trusted her, the ones who'd voted for her. She'd built her career on being the one who didn't flinch, who didn't hide. Now, with the world screaming her name, she had to decide how to fight back. By midnight, the hospital had tightened security, turning away reporters posing as visitors. Crockett's phone buzzed with messages from colleagues, some offering support, others asking pointed questions about the Lisbon allegations. A text from a fellow congresswoman read, "Tell me this isn't what it looks like." Crockett didn't reply. She handed the phone to Keon, her voice firm. No statements tonight. Let them talk. Tomorrow we start answering. Keon hesitated, then nodded. He knew she was right. Rushing out, a denial would look desperate weak. But he also knew the clock was ticking. Lena's thread had opened a floodgate, and more voices were bound to follow. Already a conservative news site was teasing a major revelation about Crockett set to drop in the morning. The truth, whatever it was slipping through their fingers, and the public wasn't waiting for clarity. They were picking sides, drawing lines, and writing their own endings to a story that was only just beginning. The morning after the hospital discharge, Jasmine Crockett stepped out into a world that felt both familiar and alien. The Dallas sun was unrelenting, but the air carried a chill that had nothing to do with the weather. Reporters lingered near her apartment, their cameras trained on the door, but she slipped out through a side exit. Her chief of staff, Keon Pard, driving her to a small community center in Oak Cliff. No press, no cameras, just a room full of folding chairs and a dozen volunteers planning a voter registration drive. Crockett wore jeans and a simple blouse, her hair pulled back, no trace of the polished congresswoman from the State Line Live set. She sat among the group listening as a young organizer outlined their goals. Her presence, quiet but grounding. "We're not here to talk about last night," she said when someone glanced her way, her voice steady but warm. "We're here to keep the work going." The volunteers nodded, but their eyes held questions, concern, maybe even awe. The collapse had made her human, not just a name on a ballot, and they wanted to believe in her still. Outside, the world wasn't so forgiving. Social media churned with new theories fueled by Lena Harris's cryptic tweets and a leaked email, allegedly from Crockett's office, mentioning a discreet meeting in Lisbon. The email was vague, lacking context, but it was enough to keep #Crockett caught trending. A morning talk show host on Fox News waved a printout of it, declaring, "This is what happens when you preach transparency, but live in shadows." Crockett's supporters fought back, flooding Instagram with photos of her at food banks, town halls, anywhere she'd shown up for her district. "They're trying to bury her because she's real," one caption read, liked 40,000 times. But the noise was deafening, and Crockett knew silence wasn't an option anymore. She started small, deliberate. That afternoon, she spoke at a library in Mesquite. A crowd of 50, mostly retirees and local activists. No podium, just a microphone passed around. "I'm not perfect," she said, her voice raw but resolute. "But I've never hidden who I am from you." "Those papers," Senator Kennedy waved, "they're pieces of a puzzle, not the whole picture. I'm here to fill in the rest." She didn't mention Lisbon directly, not yet, but she promised answers soon. The crowd listened, some nodding, others skeptical, but they stayed until the end. A woman in her 60s approached afterward, gripping Crockett's hand. "I saw you fall. I thought you were done. But you're here. That means something." Crockett smiled, but inside she was wrestling with the weight of it all. Lena's betrayal, Kennedy's ambush, the email now circulating like wildfire. Keon, standing nearby, whispered, "You're winning them back, one room at a time." But both knew it would take more than heartfelt talks to shift the narrative. The public wanted facts, and they wanted them now. Back at her office, Crockett and her team dug into damage control. Keon had hired a private investigator to trace the email's origins, suspecting it was either doctored or taken out of context. Tara, the young aide, was combing through Crockett's travel records, cross-referencing every trip against public disclosures. "The Lisbon thing," Tara said, looking up from her laptop. "It was a conference, right? Why wasn't it listed?" Crockett sighed, rubbing her temples. "It was a last-minute invite, a women's leadership summit. I paid for the flight myself, but the organizers booked the hotel. I didn't think it needed to be public. It wasn't official business." Keon frowned. "That's the problem. It looks like you hid it." Crockett nodded, her jaw tight. "I know. I should have been more careful. But there's nothing sinister here. No secret deals, no shady meetings." Keon leaned forward. "Then we need to prove it. Fast." The investigator's initial report came in that evening. The email was real, but incomplete, part of a longer thread about logistics, not covert plans. The full context could clear Crockett, but finding the original server would take days, maybe weeks. In the meantime, Lena Harris was scheduled to appear on a conservative podcast, promising more revelations. Crockett's team braced for impact. Kennedy, meanwhile, wasn't idle. He appeared on a Sunday morning news show, his drawl as disarming as ever. "I didn't want to hurt anyone," he said, his eyes soft but calculated. "I just believe folks deserve to know if their leaders are being straight with them." When pressed about the specifics of his evidence, he demurred, saying, "The documents speak for themselves. I'm not here to play prosecutor." His restraint only fueled speculation, making him seem measured, principled, even as holes began to appear in his case. A fact-checking site analyzed the customs log he'd shown, noting the tail number matched a jet leased by multiple clients, not just one mysterious company. The hotel invoice, too, lacked a direct link to Crockett. Her initials were on a booking, but so were others. Twitter users pounced with #KennedyBluff, gaining traction among Crockett's defenders. "He's got nothing but smoke and mirrors," one post read retweeted 25,000 times. But Kennedy's base didn't care about the cracks. They saw him as a crusader exposing a system rotten with hypocrisy. Crockett's next move came at a community college in Fort Worth, where she spoke to a packed auditorium of students and faculty. This time she addressed the allegations head-on. "Yes, I went to Lisbon," she said, her voice steady, the microphone amplifying every word. "It was a summit for women in leadership, a chance to learn to connect. I paid my own way, but I didn't report the trip publicly because it wasn't taxpayer-funded. That was a mistake, and I own it. But let me be clear. There were no secret deals, no hidden agendas. Just a woman trying to do better for her community." The room erupted in applause, not unanimous, but loud enough to drown out the skeptics. She went further, pulling out her own folder copies of her flight receipts, emails with the summit organizers, even a photo of her speaking at the event. "This is what transparency looks like," she said, holding up the papers. "Not a gotcha moment on live TV, but the truth, plain and simple." The students cheered their phones, capturing every second. By evening, clips of her speech were trending with #CrockettFights, back climbing the charts. The tide was turning, but not without resistance. Lena's podcast dropped that night, a 30-minute interview filled with innuendo but little substance. She claimed Crockett had met with questionable figures in Lisbon, but offered no names, no dates, just vague accusations. The host pressed for details, but Lena deflected, saying, "I'm protecting my sources." The interview backfired, with even some conservative commenters calling it all talk, no proof. A progressive blogger posted Lena's got nothing, and Kennedy's running out of steam. Jasmine's receipts are louder than their lies. It got 60,000 likes. Crockett's team seized the moment, scheduling a press conference for the next morning. In a small Dallas hotel ballroom, she faced a sea of reporters, her folder now thicker, her resolve unshaken. "I'm not here to play victim," she began, her voice cutting through the camera clicks. "I'm here to set the record straight. Every document I've shared has been verified. Every claim I've made can be checked. Senator Kennedy wanted a fight, but I'm offering facts." She laid out the Lisbon trip in detail, dates, costs, attendees, along with emails proving the summit's legitimacy. When a reporter asked about Lena Crockett, didn't flinch. "She's entitled to her story. But stories aren't evidence. I've given you mine." The press conference aired live on local news, with national outlets picking up the feed. Viewers at home watched a different Crockett, not the shaken figure from the studio, but a leader reclaiming her narrative. Social media lit up with a viral tweet reading, "Jasmine didn't just survive Kennedy's ambush. She's rewriting the rules." It hit 100,000 retweets by noon. Even some of Kennedy's supporters wavered, with a conservative radio host admitting, "She's got more backbone than I expected." But Crockett wasn't celebrating. Back in her office, she sat with Keon, the investigator's latest report, in hand. The email's source was still elusive, and Lena's podcast had planted enough doubt to keep the story alive. "We're not out of this yet," she told Keon, her voice tired but determined. "But we're closer." Keon nodded, his phone buzzing with new messages of support. "You showed them who you are today," he said. "That's what matters." Outside the Dallas skyline glittered a reminder of the city she'd sworn to serve. Crockett looked out the window, her mind already on the next step, knowing the fight for trust was far from over. Weeks had passed since the press conference, and the storm surrounding Jasmine Crockett's collapse on live television had settled into a quieter but no less potent hum. The hashtags #Crockett fights, back and #Crockett caught still flickered across social media, but the frenzy had softened, replaced by a growing respect for the Congresswoman's resilience. She returned to her district with a renewed focus, diving into the work that had always grounded her school board meetings, ribbon cuttings at community centers, quiet conversations with constituents at local diners. The Dallas skyline, once a backdrop to her public unraveling, now felt like a steadying force, a reminder of the people who'd stood by her. Yet the weight of the ordeal lingered. Lena Harris's podcast had fizzled her vague accusations, failing to gain traction without evidence, and John Kennedy had retreated to his usual Senate duties, his folder of documents no longer making headlines. The leaked email, after exhaustive digging by Crockett's investigator, was revealed to be a partial fabrication, its context twisted to mislead. A tech outlet traced it to a now-deleted account, linked to a political operative, though no direct tie to Kennedy was proven. The public, tired of the back and forth, began to move on, but Crockett knew the real battle wasn't over. It wasn't about silencing her critics, it was about rebuilding trust, not just with her voters, but with herself. She found her footing in the small moments. One Saturday, she visited a food bank in South Dallas, rolling up her sleeves to pack boxes alongside volunteers. The room buzzed with chatter, but when she stepped in, a hush fell, followed by warm smiles. A young mother, balancing a toddler on her hip, approached her. I saw you on TV, not the fall, but after, when you stood up and explained everything. My daughter watched too. She said she wants to be like you." Crockett's throat tightened, but she managed to nod. "Tell her to be better than me," she said, her voice soft. The mother laughed, and the moment passed, but it stayed with Crockett, a reminder that her actions rippled beyond the headlines. She kept showing up at a housing forum in Oak Cliff, a youth mentorship program in Cedar Hill, a health clinic fundraiser in Lancaster. Each event was small, untelevised, but the crowds grew drawn not by scandal but by her refusal to hide. A local barber, after shaking her hand at a community cookout, said, "You didn't run when they came for you. That's why we're still here." Crockett smiled, but inside she was still piecing herself back together, learning to trust her own voice again. The turning point came unexpectedly, not on a grand stage, but in a fluorescent-lit room at a Fort Worth community center. Crockett had agreed to join a roundtable with high school students working on civic projects, voter drives, park cleanups, things most politicians would skip for flashier gigs. The room was modest with scuffed linoleum floors and a coffee pot nobody touched. The students, a mix of shy and bold, sat around a long table. Their notebooks opened, their questions earnest. Crockett, in a sweater and slacks, blended in like a teacher, not a congresswoman. They talked about local issues, school funding, public transit, until a girl maybe 16 raised her hand. Her voice was quiet but firm. "Miss Crockett, how do you keep going when everyone's waiting for you to mess up again?" The question hung in the air, raw and unguarded. The other students leaned forward, their pens still. Crockett felt the weight of their eyes, not accusing, but searching, as if her answer could unlock something for them, too. She took a breath, then motioned to a volunteer. "Can someone record this? I want to say something." A phone was propped on a stack of folders, its camera framing Crockett, as she leaned forward, elbows on her knees. "I'm not going to lie to you," she began, her voice low, steady, the kind that pulls you in. "When I fell on that stage, I thought it was over. Not just my career, but the part of me that believed I could make a difference. I've spent my life fighting for people who don't get heard, families like yours, kids like you. But that night, all anyone saw was a woman who looked guilty even if she wasn't. And it hurt. Not because of the headlines, but because I wondered if I'd let you down." The room was silent, save for the faint hum of the air conditioner. What got me through wasn't courage. It was knowing I had a choice: stay down or get up. I chose to get up, not for me, but for every person who's ever been told their mistakes define them. You don't have to be perfect to matter. You just have to be honest. She paused, her eyes beating the girls. "That trip to Lisbon. It was a mistake. Not because I did anything wrong, but because I didn't think it through. I didn't see how it could look, how it could hurt the trust I'd built. But I didn't hide from it. I stood in front of cameras, in front of rooms like this, and owned it. And let me tell you something. Owning your mistakes doesn't make you weak. It makes you real. It's what lets you look people in the eye and say, I'm still here and I'm still fighting." The students were rapt, some nodding, others scribbling notes. When people come for you, and they will, don't let them make you small. Don't let them rewrite your story. You speak your truth, not with anger, not with excuses, but with facts and heart. Because someone out there is watching, waiting to see if you'll break. Show them you won't. The clip uploaded by Keon that night with the caption, "This is why we keep going," wasn't polished. The lighting was harsh, the audio tinny, but it didn't matter. By morning, it had 9 million views. Teachers shared it in classrooms, activists posted it on Instagram, and a community organizer in Houston turned Crockett's words into a mural. You don't have to be perfect to matter. The video didn't go viral for drama. It resonated because it was honest. A rare glimpse of a leader speaking not to cameras, but to people. The girl who'd asked the question, Aisha, wrote Crockett a letter a week later saying she'd applied for a city youth council because of that day. "I was scared to speak up," she wrote, "but you made me think I could." Crockett kept the letter on her desk, a quiet anchor amid the noise. The lesson wasn't just for Aisha, it was for everyone who watched. Crockett's journey showed that leadership isn't about never falling. It's about what you do when you hit the ground. She didn't lash out at Kennedy, or Lena didn't chase clout with fiery clapbacks. She chose accountability, showing up in rooms where people could see her, question her, trust her again. Her approval ratings in her district climbed, not because she was flawless, but because she was real. Young voters especially began citing her as proof that politics could be more than posturing. At a college panel in Austin, a student asked, "How do we know who to trust?" Crockett's answer was simple: trust the ones who admit when they're wrong and keep working anyway. The room applauded, and the clip trended for days. Kennedy, for his part, never addressed the Lisbon allegations again. His documents, once a bombshell, were now a footnote overshadowed by Crockett's transparency. He issued a single tweet, wishing her strength in her service, but it felt hollow, a formality. The public had moved on, not because the truth was fully settled, but because Crockett had changed the conversation. She pushed 2 local initiatives: that season 1 for affordable housing, another for youth job training, both rooted in the needs she'd heard at those community meetings. They weren't headline grabbers, but they mattered to the people in her district, the ones who'd seen her at her lowest, and still believed in her. The legacy of that Fort Worth moment wasn't just Aisha's letter or the mural in Houston. It was the quiet shift in how people saw Crockett, not as a politician who survived a scandal, but as a woman who taught them how to stand up after a fall. She didn't need a stage or a spotlight to prove it. She did it in a room of kids with a shaky phone camera and a heart that refused to break. The lesson was clear. Mistakes don't define you, but your response does. Speak your truth, even when it's hard, because someone's watching, waiting to find their own courage in yours. And that, more than any vote or headline, was what carried Crockett forward into a future she was still building, one honest step at a time.